Hi, it's Daniel Murphy, and we're back on that elm tree that we dropped yesterday. It was a dead elm. Studying the stump. There's always a lot of information you can gain from studying the stump if you know what you're looking at. So I'll just review exactly what happened here. This cut right here was the notch. I used an open face notch, only 6 inches deep. I then plunged cut from both sides in for the back cut, setting the hinge up perfectly. And then I cut in from the back side here, from both sides with a back release cut. Once the two cuts had bypassed, I just gave the signal for the truck to give it a little gas, and the tree went right over. The width of the hinge at the front of the notch, at the back of the notch, the front of the hinge is 21 inches. The width of the hinge actually at the back though was 28.5 inches. All right, so I made the notch first. Then I plunged cut the saw in from both sides, keeping the level of the back cut just slightly above the notch. 1/2 inch, at the most 3/4 or 1 inch. I definitely don't like the 2 inch height on the back cut. This profile shot shows the height of the cuts relative to each other. To your right, obviously, is the notch. The highest cut above that is the plunge cut that set the hinge up. Now that plunge cut is only at max 1 inch above the floor of the notch. And in most suburban situations, that's all you're going to need. If you're looking for falling accuracy, the best cut is to make it exactly at level. But what you often don't want to do is you don't want to make that plunge cut below the floor of the notch. That creates a situation where you have to put a lot more pull on the tree to get her to go. In logging scenarios, they recommend a 2-inch stump shot or a 2-inch differential there, making that back cut 2 inches higher than the floor of the notch. That is not necessary in almost all suburban situations. Just the sheer mass of some of these trees, falling some of these old growth trees, as soon as that tree begins to tilt forward, it's putting a lot of pressure to make the butt of the tree slide backwards. So by leaving a 2-inch lip there, you're going to create a safety so that butt of the tree doesn't slide back over the stump towards the faller. Another issue with stump shot is the amount of force it takes to actually get the hinge to start moving, to trip the fall. The higher the amount of stump shot, the more fiber that is needed you need to break there, which is going to take more force. If you're pulling a back leaner or you're just short on pulling power, you don't want to create a situation where you have to get more force, and therefore you're going to have to thin the hinge up in order to get the tree to start moving. In any case, 1 inch is almost always what I go for, or a 1/2 inch when I'm in suburban situations. These hinge fibers here, these long fibers sticking up, show that this hinge actually did have good holding ability. This hinge held well. There was good holding ability in the hinge, and was able to control the fall pretty much all the way to the ground. So this is a perfect example of a good plunge cut, which is an excellent technique in certain situations. It's certainly not necessary all the time, but when you need it, it's very, very helpful. One of the greatest advantages of the plunge cut is it allows you to exactly set the height of the back cut relative to the notch. One of the most important things to get down though is you have to be able to level that bar out and make sure your bar's plunged in there level, which there's a tendency for that tip to drop down. So when you're first starting to use plunge cuts, always double check. Just look at the tip of the bar and bring it up a little bit if it looks low to you. Being able to exactly hit the height of the back cut perfectly is very important in certain situations. Let's say the tree's growing on an angle, or the ground is sloping, or the saw's not cutting straight. If you start from the backside, you may not hit the exact spot where you want to hit as far as the height of the back cut, and that can be problematic. So plunging helps in that regard. There's some other issues that it helps with as well. It prevents barber chair, and it allows you to set the width of the hinge perfectly so that you can set that hinge up exactly how you want with plenty of time to think about it. The issue though is that you have to know what kind of hinge you want to set up ahead of time and have it visualized in your mind, rather than just cutting from the back, having 2 or 3 guys pull on the rope, and when it starts to go, stop cutting. It's much better to be able to set up the hinge, stand up, walk away, call for the pull, and you know the tree's going to go your direction. That's how I prefer to do it. The depth of the notch here, you can see I only cut 6 inches in it's 38 inches across here, or 36 here, depending on how you measure it. So we're certainly not at the 1/3 of the way through. If we were 38 inches, 1/3 into cutting a notch 1/3 of the depth would actually be over 12 inches. It wasn't necessary in this situation. The other thing that's taught, and it's important to keep in mind, is that as long as the hinge is 80% of the width of the diameter of the cut, it's not really necessary to go that deep. And you know, and these are all just guidelines. I mean, it's good when you're learning how to fall trees to practice the guidelines. It's certainly not necessary in all situations. The reason I cut a fairly shallow notch on this tree is simply because it was an easier cut to make. Shallower was going to be faster and quicker because of the shape of the tree. The hinge was still pretty wide on the backside. Being elm and the fact that I had a truck pulling here, I simply didn't need more control out of the hinge. If I need more control of the hinge, specifically to fight side weight, oftentimes I'll make that notch almost halfway through. So when the back cut comes in, the hinge is full side to side, the full diameter of the tree. That allows me to keep a lot more hinge fiber in the hinge, and specifically making the hinge longer gives it a lot more leverage to fight side lean, if that makes sense. The other thing is, if you're trying to throw the center of gravity of the tree or the piece forward relative to the hinge, it's going to make it easier to pull over. So sometimes I just want to give myself a little more advantage when I'm pulling a piece over. If I make that notch a little deeper, the hinge is going to go back, meaning the weight of the tree is going to be forward relative to that hinge, and it'll be easier to get over. This can be very helpful when you're chunking down a spar. Sometimes it's easier just to cut a very deep notch more than halfway through the tree piece, and then when you make your back cut, the piece will just fall right into the notch, and you don't even have to push it over or put a pull line on it. That's called cutting a lean into the tree. The other concern is barber chair. When you're making a shallow notch like this, there is going to be more of a tendency for the tree to barber chair. Not an issue when I'm plunge cutting, and certainly not an issue on elm, which would be very, very hard to split. But if it was a tree like an ash that was more prone to barber chair and I wasn't plunge cutting the back cut, cutting a shallow notch like this is no bueno. You can definitely run into problems with barber chair there. There's a lot of question and debate about how wide a hinge should be relative to the size of the stump. They talk about 10% of diameter. That would be 3.8 inches or almost 4 inches. This notch was fine. There's some wider points here that are close to 3 inches, but it's about 2.5 to 2 3/4 of an inch right there. The hinge looks fairly narrow relative to the size of this stump. In this situation, the tree had back lean, and so I was trying to thin out the hinge to make the hinge easier to break, so the force of the pull line would mostly go to compensating for the back lean. The other thing is, I didn't have an issue with side lean. It was elm, it was good hinging wood. I knew I was going to get directional control from a smaller hinge. If I have a tree where I need more control, and I'm especially concerned about side weight, or it's a very poor hinging wood, I'm going to make that hinge a lot fatter, sometimes 4, 5, 6 inches even, and pull with lots and lots of pull. I do believe in fat hinges. I believe they give you more control, but I don't use them unless it's necessary. The silver maple stump that I'm standing on has a very, very thick hinge. Silver maple is a very poorly hinging wood. The piece had a lot of side lean. I was trying to get more control by cutting a fatter hinge. That hinge was probably 6 inches wide and maybe a 3-foot cut there, or even less. So that was well over 20%, or at least 20% of the diameter of the cut, and it worked extremely well. That piece held a long way to the ground, and you could hear it in the video as the squeaking and ripping and tearing throughout the course of the fall, and you can also see the evidence of that large piece of wood sticking up. It's like a big splinter sticking up. That had to pull out of the hinge. It didn't just break. Now, the stump in the foreground is a little smaller hinge there. That probably had a little front lean to it. I didn't need to cut a deep notch on that one, and I didn't need much control out of the hinge, so I cut a more narrow hinge on that. Generally, if you have enough pull, a 2 to 2.5 inch hinge is going to work on just about every tree. So a 2 foot tree, 24 inches, that would be about 10%. But a 4 foot tree, generally 2.5 inches will work on that, maybe 3 inches. But a 1 foot tree, rather than 1 inch, you want to go 1.5 inches or 2 inches. You want to leave enough meat on that hinge to give yourself control as long as you have the force to get the tree over. Generally, I use pull lines. When you use wedges, there may be some different considerations because wedging a tree over is going to be much harder than pulling a tree over. So the thickness of the hinge really does matter, because when you have to fight the thickness of the hinge with wedges, it's a lot more work. So there's lots of factors to consider. I hope you're getting some insights here. I know it's a lot if you're not familiar with this stuff. It's a lot of information to try to take in at once. Studying the stump will never lie. The stump will tell you exactly what happened here and during the falling process. When you study your stumps, make sure make sure you didn't overcut, make sure you didn't cut too high, too low. All these things. Look at which fibers held. Look at how high your back cut was relative to your notch. Look at how the tree fell, and you can see exactly what happened by studying the stump. So I hope you learned something today. Thanks very much. Hope you catch another video sometime soon. So this is an old video that probably wouldn't have been ever edited up if it weren't for this COVID issue going on right now. Send you all some blessings and wishing you well, wishing your families well, all your loved ones. And hope you can use this opportunity to make something good happen, just like this video wouldn't have happened without COVID. Maybe you could use this to do whatever kind of change or anything you want to do with your life. Really gives us a chance to get our priorities straight, maybe spend a little more time with your family, work on some projects, or develop yourself in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. And again, I'm wishing you well. God bless each and every one of you. And I'm praying for a good outcome here for all humanity in this entire world.